Okay, so imagine you've just conquered the largest empire the world has ever seen. You're standing on top of everything from the edge of India to the shores of Greece. Roughly 40% of every human being alive answers to you. And the first thought that runs through your head, once the dust settles, is not about armies or glory. It's a much smaller, much scarier question. How do I actually pay for all this? Because an empire is not a trophy, it's a bill. Roads have to be built. Soldiers have to be fed, governors have to be watched, palaces don't heat themselves. And every single day that the sun comes up over your 20-some provinces, that bill gets a little bigger. Here's the thing nobody tells you about ancient conquest. The winning is the easy part. Cyrus the Great could take a city in an afternoon. The hard part, the part that actually decides whether your empire lasts 30 years or 200, is the boring stuff. The accounting. And the Persians, it turns out, were quietly some of the greatest accountants the ancient world ever produced. They built a money machine so effective that it funded the largest state on earth for 2 centuries, and most people today have no idea how it worked. So let's do what every good investigator does. Let's follow the money. And we'll start with a single clay tablet. To understand Persian wealth, you first have to understand that there were really 2 Persian economies running at the same time, side by side, doing completely different jobs. The first one you'd recognize instantly. It ran on precious metals and taxes. The second one would look completely alien to you, because it barely used money at all. It ran on grain, sheep, and beer. We'll get to that second one, because honestly it's the more surprising of the 2. Hold that thought. Let's begin with the machine that Darius built. When Darius I took the throne around 522 BC, the empire he inherited was, financially speaking, a mess. His predecessors, Cyrus and Cambyses, hadn't really collected taxes at all. They collected gifts. A conquered people would show up, hand over whatever they felt like. Some horses, some gold, a nice bowl, and everyone smiled and went home. It was warm. It was personal. It was completely useless for running a budget, because you never knew what was coming in. Darius looked at this, and did something that made him, in the words of the Persians themselves, more of a shopkeeper than a king. They actually had a saying: Cyrus was a father, Cambyses was a tyrant, and Darius was a tradesman, always looking to turn a profit. And they didn't entirely mean it as a compliment. What Darius did was invent the world's first serious imperial tax system. He divided the empire into about 20 tax districts, called satrapies, each run by a governor called a satrap. But he didn't just guess at what each one should pay. He had the land measured, physically measured. Surveyors went out and recorded how much farmland there was, how fertile it was, what crops it grew, even how many fruit trees were standing. In Babylonia, we've actually found the cadastral records, the tax documents that list the trees and the fields. Then he averaged the harvest over several years and set a fixed annual tax based on the productive capacity of the land. Not a guess, a calculation. And the numbers were staggering. According to the Greek historian Herodotus, who gives us the most famous breakdown, the empire pulled in around 14,560 talents of silver every single year. A talent is roughly 26 kilograms of precious metal, so we're talking about something on the order of hundreds of thousands of kilograms of silver flowing toward the center of the empire, year after year, like clockwork. Now here's where it gets interesting, because the bill wasn't split evenly. Not even close. Babylon and Assyria, the rich agricultural heartland of Mesopotamia, paid 1,000 talents of silver a year, the single heaviest cash assessment in the whole empire. Egypt paid 700 talents, plus grain to feed the Persian garrison stationed there. The wealthy provinces of Asia Minor, the Lydians and their neighbors, paid 500. Meanwhile, the far-flung, poorer or more troublesome regions paid a fraction of that. And then there was India. The Indian province was described as the most populous in the known world, and it didn't pay in silver at all. It paid in gold dust. 360 talents of it. When you convert that gold into its silver value at the going rate, Herodotus reckoned it was worth almost as much as several rich provinces combined. India alone was carrying a huge share of the imperial budget, so already you can see the shape of the thing. This was a progressive system, in the crudest sense. The rich lands subsidized the empire, and the poor frontier paid little. It was deliberate, it was calculated, and it was ruthless in a way we'll come back to. But notice something about who wasn't on that list. Persia itself, the homeland. The Persians, as the ruling people, paid no tax at all. Zero. That was the entire point of being at the top. You didn't fund the empire funded you. Now, where did all this metal actually go? Because this is one of the strangest facts about Persian wealth, and it tells you everything about how their minds worked. The kings didn't spend most of it. They hoarded it. Herodotus tells us that when the tribute arrived, they would melt the silver and gold down and pour it into large clay jars. Then, once the metal had cooled and hardened, they'd smash the clay away, leaving a solid lump of bullion, and there it would sit, in the treasury, doing nothing. When they needed money, they'd chip a piece off the lump and coin exactly as much as they required. Right then. Think about what that means. The empire was sitting on a mountain of frozen wealth, a vast reserve of precious metal locked away in the vaults at Persepolis and Susa. For decades, an enormous share of the ancient world's silver and gold was quietly pulled out of circulation and turned into inert blocks in a royal storeroom. This is going to matter enormously later, when we talk about how it all ended. Remember the frozen treasure. But the Persians weren't only hoarders. Darius also did something no Persian king had done before. He minted his own coins. 2 of them, actually. A gold coin called the daric, and a silver coin called the siglos. And the exchange rate was fixed. 1 gold daric was worth exactly 20 silver sigloi. The daric weighed about 8 1/3 grams and was almost pure gold, 98–99%. On the front, it showed the Persian king himself, kneeling, drawing a bow. It was the first coin in history to put a living ruler's image on it, and it was pure political advertising. Every time that coin changed hands anywhere in the ancient world, it said the same thing. The king of Persia is watching, and he is rich. And the daric became exactly that, an international currency. It was trusted from Greece to Afghanistan because the gold content was so reliable. Merchants across the Mediterranean accepted it without blinking. But here's a detail that reveals how the Persians really saw money, and it's easy to miss. That gorgeous, world-famous gold coinage was mostly minted in one place, at Sardis, out in the western part of the empire near the Greek world. And it mostly circulated there, in the west. In the Iranian heartland, the actual core of the empire, coins were barely used at all. The homeland ran on barter and weighed silver, not on shiny gold pieces with the king's face on them. Which brings us, finally, to that second economy I told you to remember, the one that didn't really run on money. Because if you had walked into the administrative heart of the empire, into the offices around Persepolis, you would not have found a bustling marketplace of coins. You'd have found something that looks much more like a giant government warehouse. We know this because of an incredible archaeological accident. Buried at Persepolis, archaeologists found thousands upon thousands of small clay tablets, an entire bureaucratic archive that recorded the day-to-day running of the empire's core. And what those tablets describe is astonishing. Nearly everyone working for the state was paid in rations, not in coins, in food and commodities. In grain, in wine, in beer, in oil, in sheep. The empire ran an enormous, centrally planned distribution system. Workers, and there were thousands of them, moving grain, building roads, tending the royal estates, received a fixed salary measured out in liters of barley and jugs of wine. And here's the part that genuinely surprises people. This was a paid workforce, not a slave one. The tablets record wages going to laborers from all over the empire. They record women in the workforce receiving rations. In some cases, the records show extra rations going to women who had just given birth, a kind of ancient maternity provision. The scale and the precision of this record-keeping, the fact that some clerk 2,500 years ago wrote down exactly how many liters of grain went to a specific work gang on a specific day, is one of the most sophisticated administrative achievements of the entire ancient world. So picture the 2 economies now, side by side. Out west, gleaming gold darics and international trade. In the center, a vast, meticulous ration system, moving mountains of grain and sheep. One empire, 2 completely different financial nervous systems, and Darius's genius was that he ran both at once. Now, none of this works, none of it, without one more ingredient. And this is the one everyone forgets. You can measure all the land you want and set all the taxes you like, but if you can't physically move the wealth, the information, and the soldiers across an empire that stretches thousands of miles, you have nothing. Taxes uncollected are just numbers on a tablet, so the Persians built a road. Not just any road, the royal road, running roughly 1,600 miles from Sardis in the west all the way to Susa near the imperial core. And along it, they built a relay system that was, for its time, almost unbelievable. Way stations at regular intervals, each stocked with fresh horses and riders. A royal courier could hand off a message to the next rider, who galloped to the next station, and so on down the line. A journey that would take an ordinary traveler around 3 months could be covered by the royal post in about a week. That road was the empire's spine. It carried tax revenue toward the treasury. It carried royal orders out to the provinces. It carried armies to trouble spots. It carried merchants and their goods, which meant it carried trade, which meant it generated even more wealth. And critically, it carried surveillance. The king's messages moved so fast that a rebellious satrap way out on the frontier could never be sure how much time he had before the center found out. Speed of information was, in itself, a form of control, because that's what the whole system was really about: control. And this is where we have to be honest about the darker mechanics, the way any empire this size ultimately holds together. The satraps were enormously powerful men, running provinces the size of countries, sitting on huge revenues, sometimes minting their own local coinage. That's a recipe for breakaway kingdoms. So the Persians layered watchers on top of watchers. The satrap governed, but a separate military commander often controlled the troops, and royal inspectors, sometimes called the eyes and ears of the king, moved through the provinces checking that the money was flowing and the loyalty held. Divide the power so no single man ever holds all of it in one place. And underneath all of it sat the farmers. Always the farmers. Because for all the gold and all the clever administration, the real engine of this empire was agriculture, and the people who did the actual work of feeding it. In the dry heartland of Iran, they built something extraordinary to make that possible: an underground irrigation system called the qanat, gently sloping tunnels that carried water for miles from the base of the mountains to the fields, without losing it to evaporation in the desert sun. Some of those tunnels are still carrying water today, thousands of years later. That was the foundation the whole glittering structure stood on. Water in the ground, grain in the field, a farmer paying his assessed share. And that share could be brutal. Those same Babylonian records that show us the careful tax accounting also show us the cost. In some years, ordinary people in Babylonia had to mortgage their land just to raise the silver they owed, and in the worst cases, the records show families forced to hand over their own children into debt slavery to pay the tax. The precision of the system, the very thing that made it so effective, is exactly what made it so heavy on the people at the bottom. A fixed tax doesn't care whether your harvest was good or bad. It's due either way. So now let's do the final accounting. Because for 200 years, this machine worked. The land was measured, the taxes flowed, the roads carried the revenue, the treasury filled with frozen silver, and the empire endured. On paper, the Persian economy was one of the most successful the world had ever built. And then Alexander showed up. Here's the part that ties it all together, and it comes right back to that frozen treasure I told you to remember. When Alexander of Macedon marched into the Persian heartland and captured the imperial cities, he didn't just win a war, he found the vaults. He found decades, generations, of accumulated silver and gold. That mountain of hoarded bullion the kings had been melting into jars and stockpiling since the days of Darius. And it was almost incomprehensibly vast. Ancient sources describe it as one of the largest concentrations of precious metal ever seized at a single stroke. And here's the brutal economic irony. The very strategy that had made the empire so stable, hoarding wealth instead of spending it, pulling the world's silver out of circulation and locking it in the treasury, is what made the prize so catastrophic to lose. All that frozen money, suddenly unfrozen, dumped into the ancient economy at once, financing Alexander's armies and reshaping the entire Mediterranean world. The Persians had spent 200 years filling a reservoir. Alexander opened the dam in an afternoon. So what's the actual lesson buried in all of this? It's tempting to say the Persian Empire was rich because it conquered a lot of land. But that's not really it. Plenty of conquerors grabbed enormous territory and watched it fall apart within a generation because they never solved the boring problem. The Persians solved it. They understood something that most people, even today, underestimate. That the difference between a fortune and a functioning economy is administration. It's the survey. It's the tax roll. It's the road that gets the money home and the clerk who writes down exactly how much grain the workers were paid. The Persians weren't the fiercest warriors in the ancient world, and they knew it. What they were was organized. They took the messy, personal, gift-giving world they inherited and turned it into a system, measured, recorded, and reliable, that could feed an empire spanning 3 continents for 2 centuries. They proved something that every large organization since has had to relearn the hard way. Anyone can win the thing. The real power belongs to whoever can afford to keep it, and keeping it is always an accounting problem. The Persians didn't just conquer the ancient world, they learned how to run it, and that turned out to be the far rarer skill.